Welcome to The World This Week. I'm François Picard. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. The start of the show, this is normally the time at which I turn to Daily Beast foreign editor Christopher Dickey, based here in the French capital. Chris passed away late Thursday of an apparent heart attack suddenly at the age of 68. It's a giant of journalism who has gone. He'd regale us with tales of his start on the Metro desk at the Washington Post, postings to Central America and to the Middle East, later with Newsweek magazine, and then making the switch to digital with the Daily Beast, always offering insights and perspective on the great reporting of his correspondents out in the field. Joining us is one of those, Dana Thomas, who is today contributing freelance reporter for the New York Times, author of Fashionopolis. Thanks for joining us from Saint-Tropez.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us from not too far away in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence is Paul Taylor, contributing editor for Politico. Thanks for being with us.
Hi, François. It's good to be with you, but a sad day for journalism.
And joining us from Paris, Craig Capitas, editor-at-large for Quartz. Craig, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Yeah, the tributes have been pouring in. The obituary for Christopher Dickey, written by Rome correspondent Barbie Latza-Nadeau, begins with the following line: "The hardest thing about writing an obituary for Chris Dickey is not having him edit it." Dana Thomas, your thoughts on that and on what it was like working for and with Christopher?
Well, I was really lucky. I met Christopher in 1995. I heard that there was an opening in the bureau. They had just lost a correspondent and they weren't sending someone over. So I was already streaming for the Washington Post, which was in the same company. And I called and said, "Can I come over and see you?" And so I sat down and I walked in and I saw Mrs. Graham's picture on his bulletin board. So I thought, oh, I'm where I'm supposed to be. And then
Catherine Graham, former editor of the Washington Post, former owner of the Washington Post.
The owner and publisher of the Washington Post, Mrs. Graham. And so I knew I was home. And then he read my resume and he said, "You used to work for Joe McClellan at the Washington Post in Washington. I used to work for Joe McClellan at the Washington Post in Washington. If you were trained by Joe, then I know you know what you're doing." And he sent me out. But he was great. He would take your copy and he would tweak it a little bit. He would cut it just as it been. He would give you the direction you needed to go to do your story. And then he would help you make it sing. He used to call some of the writing we did violins. And he would say, "Let's write some prose today." And you wouldn't think about prose in Newsweek, but when you read Christopher Dickey, you read prose. And that's why he was so wonderful.
Writing is such a cornerstone of storytelling, of journalism. Paul Taylor, your first encounter with Christopher Dickey.
So I first met Chris in the Middle East, and wherever I went in the Middle East, whether it was in Iran, in Israel, Palestine, in Egypt, Chris would always pop up in Kuwait just after the Gulf War. And he was the ideal foreign correspondent to work with because he was always helpful. He was a real gentleman. He was a professional. He was incredibly well connected. He was generous with contacts. He never kind of pulled the thing for his own exclusive or whatever, never tried to shut you out. And he was a delight to be with. And people and the story were more important than himself. And I think that's, there are a lot of big egos in journalism. And Chris was a big talent, but he was fortunately not a big ego in that way.
Yeah, and in a career that spanned more than 4 decades, there were certain stories that Christopher Dickey broke and then revisited. It was December of 1980, transitions going on between the Reagan and Carter administration, and 4 nuns are murdered in El Salvador, a story he often brought up. It was at a time of a brutal civil war. That story would, you could say, haunt Christopher Dickey for the rest of his life. He would talk about it at times. He revisited it when there was the transition from Barack Obama to Donald Trump. in 2016, 2017, warning of an authoritarian bend is possible when you have these transition periods. Christopher Dickey was a great field reporter, Craig Capitas, but he was also a great reporter in the field. How do you remember him?
Oh, the Christopher Dickey I remember was a rascal and a scoundrel and a dear friend. Now, I'm going to tell you a Dickey story. And it has nothing to do with journalism, but it'll tell you about Chris. This is back in '91 during Gulf War I. We were in a, let's just say, a country where the consumption of alcohol was illegal, dealing with a military official who didn't want to tell us anything. And a lot of us wanted to get him out of theater because he just wasn't being helpful. He would lie, in fact. So one night in a hotel room, a number of colleagues, Chris and I may or may not have been among them, decided that perhaps the best way to get rid of this guy was to get a bottle of scotch, which had been pretty much completely consumed, and put it on his room service tray, which he always left, this military guy always left outside his room. And the moment they picked it up, they throw him out of the country. And of course, Chris being Chris, like I say, he always wore a tie. He was the David Niven of foreign correspondents. Chris liked this idea, but he really didn't want to go along with it, although he impishly loved it. So we said, come on, let's do it, if we did it. So we go and do it, right? And Chris is there shaking his head, and he looks at what had been done in front of the guy's room. And he looks at us, and he walks over to it, and he rearranges it so it looks better. And he says, guys, if you're going to do it, let's do it right. And we all scamper away like little children. The next morning, this colonel was no longer in theater. They threw him out.
And yeah, oh dear. Is it okay, Dana Thomas? The statute of limitation has passed?
I think so. I have one of those stories. He was at an event when he ran into some people from Versace, and I was writing about fashion for Newsweek out of Europe. And he called me at the lunch break and said, Versace seems like it's happening again. This was in June or July, about like exactly now, July 1997. Should we cook up a story? Should you do a story on Versace? And I said, well, yeah, he just had a really good couture show, and and he's come out of cancer. Let's do it. So I hang up the phone. I'm just doing my expense accounts. It's a quiet day in July. And the phone rings, and it's a friend of mine from the AP calling to say, do you have any comments about Gianni Versace being murdered on his doorstep in Miami? I said, excuse me, what? He said, yeah, it just happened 10 minutes ago, and we thought we should call you for a quote. And I said, wait, I'll call you back. And I called Chris back on his cell. And I said, Gianni Versace was just murdered on his doorstep. He said, oh, okay, I got it. And he goes back into this luncheon, and he says, not only are we going to do a story on Gianni Versace, we're going to put him on the cover next week. And he didn't tell them why.
And you did?
And then we did, because he was murdered.
Yeah,
but he didn't say why they were putting him on the cover. He just watched their eyes, and then he said, because he was just murdered in Miami.
And Dana, you sent us this picture of the three of you together with Ginny Power. When was that?
That was in 2015 at the Anglo-American Press Association's annual gala at the U.S. Embassy. And it was rare that all three of us were in town and there at the party, because Chris was always jetting off somewhere, or he was sending me off somewhere to cover something. But we were all there, so I said, let's take a picture. We weren't at Newsweek together anymore by then, but still he was roaming and doing things with the Daily Beast, and I was out running around, and Ginny had her other gig by then. We're sorry that we lost the show at Newsweek. We had a great team together, and I was there with him for 15 years. He was so wonderful in the way that he would pick people, and then he would put them on their path. He said, for me, you should be writing about fashion and culture. He'd put you on the path, and then he'd let you do what you do, and he didn't interfere. And that's something that we also both learned from Ben Bradley when we worked for Ben Bradley at the Washington Post, the wonderful editor and he worked for Ben in the 70s and 80s, and I worked for him in the late 80s, early 90s. And that's what Ben did. And it's a really a great talent, a managerial talent, to be able to just say, I trust what you do, you're really good, and if you need help, I'm here.
All right, the show is called The World This Week, and there is the story, the only story, and you might say, since the start of this year, which has been this unexpected out of nowhere pandemic. If we look at the week's news events, we see once again how the numbers continue to soar in the United States of COVID cases. Our last pre-lockdown show in the studio, this is what Christopher Dickey had to say about the way COVID was already spiraling in the United States.
What I do know is that when you see something like this developing, the minimum that you should do is look at what kind of infrastructure you have that can deal with it. This was the signal failure in the United States. We had destroyed, or more to the point, the Trump administration had basically destroyed the infrastructure that had been created to try and deal with these kinds of pandemics of never before seen viruses, which we've had several of in the last few years. One thing that I hope would come out of this is that we realize we can see more of these viruses and they can be even worse than this. And if we don't have something in place internationally to deal with them, we are going to be in big trouble.
And Craig Kapitas, I turn to this week's news. The numbers are soaring, and yet certain states like Georgia, where the governor is saying face masks not necessary.
Yeah, well, Chris was right. Chris believed that you should never believe anything until it was officially denied, which is probably the best way to go. What's happening in the United States for a foreign correspondent abroad is a very, very difficult thing to cover. Because what we're seeing in the U.S., and Chris knew this damn well, what we are seeing is the defenestration, the destruction of the American dream, of the whole American national bulwark. Chris realized this very early on, that Trump was, yes, a dictator, elected, but a dictator and a totalitarian nonetheless.
You can't say that, Craig, you can't say that. You've had midterm elections. Trump's been voted out of, Trump candidates have been voted out.
You can say that because when you have spent a career, as Chris did, and many on this panel have, covering dictatorships and totalitarian regimes, you know one when you see one. But as I said, it's very difficult to go into a paper, particularly a legacy publication, and say that because the bar is too high. But that nonetheless does not negate the truth of that observation.
Paul Taylor?
I think that for many people around the world who, whatever their criticisms, believed that the United States had a leadership role in the free world, as we used to talk about, this has been an extraordinarily depressing experience. We have no substitute for U.S. leadership, but we also have no U.S. leadership anymore. And we have a United States that doesn't really want to lead. It wants to divide, and it wants to find scapegoats. It wants to demonize. It's inconsistent. I would hate to be in one of those acting jobs in this administration where you're trying to defend the national interest despite your president and despite some of the people closest to him.
Okay, Paul. But Paul, there's an election coming up in November. Paul, there's an election coming up in November. If Trump loses, he's out of office, and there's be somebody else. Won't it be back to where it was before then?
It's going to be a very unusual election because you won't be able to have a normal campaign. You have a president who has sort of totally abolished truth. A president, the truth is whatever he says it is, and any inconvenient facts that are true are fake news, lies, invented by his enemies, cooked up by the Chinese or whatever, or the Germans. Somehow when you're in Europe, you realize how much the world has been turned upside down. Germany was.
And we have, Paul, on that point, this EU summit, the first in-person summit since lockdown began, with Germany holding the rotating presidency. Again, that leadership void, can it be filled?
It really is an opportunity for the Europeans to say, we're capable of getting our act together. Whether they actually will in the next 24 hours or whether it'll take a little bit longer, I'm not sure. I wouldn't put too much of a bet on a deal by midnight tonight. But if the European Union is able this month to put together a plausible economic recovery fund on top of what each of the countries are doing that didn't have.
All right, losing the connection ever so slightly there with Provence there, with Saint-Rémy de Provence. Hopefully we'll get that reconnection back. Dana Thomas, having Christopher every Friday on The World This Week on France 24 and hearing him since the beginning of this pandemic, you realize just how much, well, this is one of those seminal moments for humanity, the likes of which we haven't seen since September 11th, arguably since the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Absolutely. And Chris was really good at spotting these things and understanding what they meant before anyone else did. You were just talking about what does this mean in US politics. I remember he wrote a novel about an American who infiltrated the Middle East terrorist cell and became an American terrorist, a blue-eyed blonde American kid, and that would then have a terrorist attack against America. And sure enough, a year after that book came out, that exactly happened. But he would also say, listen, Poland just elected, we got to go to Poland and see what's going on in Poland. He would understand immediately what was happening. So what he was saying about Trump was spot on. What he was saying about COVID was spot on. And we were talking earlier today, he always came at it with a European sensibility, of course, because he'd lived in Europe so long, but also Southern. It was very important that he was a Southern man in his seersucker suits and his linen suits, but he understood the Trump everything and the Trump voter because he was a Southerner and he knew these people.
A Trump voter who knew these
He wasn't
people.
a Trump voter, but he knew the people who were our Trump voters. He knew them.
Yeah. When you read,
he knew them well.
Craig Capitas.
No, he knew them well. Francois, Christopher knew that Americans never lie so much as, after a Clemson game, during a war or before an election. And he kind of brought that kind of Southern philosophy with him. It's funny, I mentioned seersucker suits. I wore my seersucker jacket today because seersucker was a topic of conversation between Christopher and I for years, and I'm sorry to digress, but he always wore a tie, as I said. He always had a tie with him. You'd be in some combat zone, and Chris would be off somewhere wearing a tie. It was just a remarkable thing to see.
Look at where he was from, his heritage from the South was something that weighed perhaps as much when he used that strong, blunt language directed towards the current occupier of the White House because of his background, his book about the buildup to the Civil War, Our Man in Charleston. Shows that a lot of that polarization that spun out of control in the buildup to the Civil War is something that he feared could be back in our midst today when you see the quote-unquote culture wars currently in the United States. And if we look at his Instagram account, for instance, when the toppling of statues happened a few weeks ago, he posted a statue which had been taken down in the 19th century, that of Alexandre Dumas Père. Alexandre Dumas Père, who was black, and again, he was a Southerner, but who was the antithesis of those who adhere to those Confederate values, you might say. Craig Capitas.
Chris was in the front of the line when it came to attempting to change the Americans' perspective on equal rights. There's no question about that. And he had a unique perspective, having grown up in the South. He realized that the Confederacy actually never said goodbye. It was hoping to see you again at a NASCAR race, and that upset him a great deal because he was. Chris was a great amateur historian. He was a wonderful person to talk history with. And if you were in a room with Chris and there happened to be a professional historian within shouting distance, you could be there for days talking and discussing history, particularly American Southern history, which he knew inside and out.
All right. It wasn't just about the United States, though. Again, Christopher Dickey, who was the foreign editor of the Daily Beast, and you could, as Craig was saying a moment ago, you could broach any topic with him. We spoke with the Daily Beast Moscow correspondent Anna Nemtsova earlier.
He was a storyteller, a very graceful and attentive storyteller. He really cared about our fragile world. And that's why he probably hated dictators and despots so much, cared for the stories from the countries which are suffering from leaders who do not respect human rights, who do not respect the law. He was able to edit tons of stuff and encourage and inspire the whole generation of feelers, reporters, and being a gentleman and being, a big heart. He taught us to care. He taught us to slow down. He taught us to actually stop and read what we write. He always told me, read to yourself, read loudly what you just wrote. And last night I received a note from Chris at about 7:45 actually. Last night I received a note that said, please do pursue that reporting and file what you know when you know it. That was the last note I received from Chris, last assignment. And I'm sure he would be happy to know that this morning I started writing the story he signed and that I will pursue the reporting.
Paul Taylor, when you think about how reporting has changed since the time when the likes of you and Christopher began, it's really the same in a way. It hasn't changed in that sense. You still have to pursue the story.
You still have to pursue the story. The pressures have changed. The pressures of real time have introduced a lot of difficulty because the time to check information before it goes to air or before it goes to market has been reduced. And therefore the temptation to rush out the unfinished product. The earth has flattened. The monthly magazine or the weekly magazine now has a website which is trying to compete with the wire service almost in terms of real-time news, because everybody's competing for eyeballs on the internet. And so the quality of the information can be affected by that. And the other thing which really affects the quality of the information is the finances of our business, which have changed completely from the comfortable advertising revenue on which the Newsweeks and the Time magazines and so on flourished for so long. And now we're all looking at very uncertain, difficult business models. And I guess that Chris and I were luckier to have been foreign correspondents when we were, because it was, relatively speaking, we were the aristocracy of the profession. And now it's very precarious. It's people working in self-employment, not getting very well paid in most of our profession, and having to struggle, and at the same time to produce quality where there is more and more pressure to do it at speed and to do it to produce it before it's, as Boris Johnson might say, oven ready.
Dana Thomas.
Yes. He taught me how to be a correspondent. He taught me how to be a foreign correspondent. Until then, had been stringing for the Washington Post, and he said, "Go there and get the story, kiddo." And he would give me time to do it. After Johnny Versace was murdered, that famous moment, and we did that cover story, he then said, "I want you to do a story on how the company changes after the murder when his sister takes over." And he gave me 9 months to report that story. And I kept reading it. Can you imagine, for a weekly? And he sent me to Calabria, and he sent me to Rome to meet the Mani Puliti, anti-corruption team with a translator. I went to Milan many times. And then he would sit down with me and go over the piece over and over again until it was just right. And when we sent it to New York,
all right. So that there is the golden age, Dana, but it's gone. Right now, nonetheless, he embraced the present, and working.
He totally embraced the present, but he taught you how to do that, and that he took the time to teach you how to do that, and then he let you go and do it. And as he did with with the Moscow Correspondent, where she said, "And when you know what you got, then file it." And that's when you knew you could do what you do. But he got you there.
I mean, just to illustrate what I was saying, the people who are on this today. We didn't start off working in the organizations we work for now. They didn't exist. No. The Daily Beast, an online publication, Politico, an online publication, Quartz, an online publication, and we're probably all self-employed at a guess. None of us is salaried. Remember what it used to be like to get that paycheck every month without having to, think about that. And so the nature of our business, I think, has changed an awful lot. Chris was incredibly adaptable to that.
Incredibly.
I think this was a man who started as a man of the written word with the Washington Post and with Newsweek, and who managed to become a multimedia journalist who could do live television, could do video, could take wonderful pictures. The picture he put up just yesterday on Facebook, perhaps his last picture, of a young woman with a dog in the street in Paris that just sort of shouted Paris at you. This is Paris, the spirit of the soul of Paris. And he's just a multi-talent, but he's somebody who illustrates how you can keep the quality as the business model changes.
And with that picture, it was very Lartigue. There's a very famous Lartigue of a woman with a dog, and I noticed it immediately. And I thought, that's what he's doing. He had a great love for photography. He had been a film student originally, and that's one of the things that was so interesting when he got involved with the filming of Deliverance, his father's book, back in the 70s, and even had a bit part in it. But he worked on the set, and he really learned about film firsthand on that movie. And he loved photography, and we would talk about cameras, and he would encourage me to write about David Bailey. I got to profile David Bailey and William Klein, and I went to see Helmut Newton and June Newton in Monte Carlo. And then we would talk about photography, and we would go see photography shows. Our favorite was when we went to see Peter Beard's show together, and then we organized to do a piece together on Peter Beard. They were very similar spirits, and they got on so brilliantly together. And when Peter Beard died in April, Chris wrote the most beautiful tribute to him, using our notes from that original luncheon that we had together. And I know that it really pained him. We talked a lot about when Peter died. He was really upset because he loved Peter's work, but he also just loved great photographers, and he spent so much time out shooting the city. He loved Paris.
He loved Paris, that is for certain, Craig Kapitas.
Oh, yeah. Chris was a fixture in this city. And one of his favorite places, God bless cliches, was Harry's Bar on 5 Rue de New. And the reason for that is, as Chris discovered years ago, that's where we should go get some drinks at Harry's in Chris's memory, because Chris was the one who found out that the oldest hot dog cooking machine still operational in the world is at Harry's at 5 Rue de New. You know the machine where you stick the dogs in and it turns?
Yes.
That was Chris discovered that was built in, I think it was 1926. And I remember when all those centuries ago, when I asked my wife to marry me, after that we decided to go and celebrate at Harry's. And I remember going in there, and the first thing I said to her, Marie Celine, let me tell you about this hot dog machine. Dickey says it was built in 1926, and even though it's 1 in the morning, we need to have a hot dog because they're really good. So yeah, Chris was very much a part of this city. Bless his heart. He will be missed by more than just a bunch of journalists yapping on France 24 with you, Francois. He was one of the good guys.
Indeed. And our thoughts go out to all the staff at the Daily Beast, be it in New York or around the world, and his family, Carol, his wife, and all those close to him. And we want to thank you so much for being with us, Dana Thomas, Paul Taylor, Craig Kapitas. And thank you for joining us here for this special tribute edition of The World This Week. Bye for now.